The sandstone cliffs of Petra glowed a deep amber as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ancient facades. The city, known as the Rose City for its vibrant hues, had stood for millennia as a marvel of human ingenuity. Its intricate carvings, etched directly into the stone, spoke of a people who defied the harshness of the desert to create something eternal. Yet, even amidst its grandeur, there were whispers of secrets buried deeper than the eye could see, of chambers and passages that lay beyond the reach of time and light. Dr. Elias Varda stood at the entrance to the Sick, the winding canyon that led to Petra's most iconic structure, the treasury. His weathered boots scraped against the gravel, each step carrying the weight of decades of exploration and discovery. But this time was different. Elias wasn't here for the treasures of history. He was here for something far older, something hidden. His colleagues had mocked him when he first mentioned the dreams, vivid, haunting visions of underground tunnels and chambers filled with symbols that defied comprehension. Stress, they had said, or perhaps just the wild imagination of a man who had spent too many nights poring over ancient texts. But Elias couldn't ignore them. The dreams felt real, as though they were guiding him to a place he was destined to find. And so he had returned to Petra, the site of his greatest discoveries and his deepest regrets, armed with little more than his instincts and a notebook filled with frantic sketches and notes. The CQ enveloped him, its towering walls narrowing the sky to a thin ribbon of fading light. As he walked, he felt the familiar pull of the place, a mixture of awe and unease. Petra had always been more than just an archaeological site to Elias. It was alive, a city with a pulse that thrummed beneath its carved facades. Tonight, that pulse seemed stronger, more insistent. He reached the end of the Seek, and there it was, the treasury, its ornate columns and statues bathed in the soft glow of the moon. Tourists were gone, leaving the site silent except for the faint rustle of the wind. Elias lingered only a moment before moving on, past the familiar landmarks and into the lesser-known parts of the city. His boots kicked up dust as he climbed a narrow path, following no map but trusting the pull in his chest that had guided him this far. It was near the end of the trail, where the cliffs rose jagged and uninviting, that Elias saw it. A pile of loose rocks stacked haphazardly against the base of a sheer rock face. At first glance, it seemed like nothing more than debris, but as he approached, he noticed something odd. The stones weren't natural. They had been placed deliberately, as if to conceal something. He crouched, his fingers brushing against the cool surface of the rock, and saw it, a faint seam running vertically through the cliff. Elias's breath quickened. This was no ordinary fissure. It was too straight, too precise, as if carved by tools far older than the Nabateans. He glanced around, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling. The site was empty, but the silence felt oppressive, as though the cliffs themselves were watching. With a grunt, he began clearing the stones, his muscles straining against their weight. Dust filled the air, clinging to his sweat-dampened skin. After what felt like an eternity, the seam widened, revealing a narrow crevice just large enough for a man to slip through. Elias hesitated, his flashlight trembling in his hand. He had spent his life chasing the unknown, but this felt different. The air leaking from the crevice was cool and damp, carrying with it a faint metallic tang that set his teeth on edge. Still, the pull was irresistible. He squeezed through the gap, the rough stones scraping against his jacket. On the other side, darkness enveloped him, broken only by the beam of his flashlight. The chamber he entered was unlike anything he had seen in Petra. The walls were smooth, almost polished, and devoid of the ornate carvings that defined the city above. Instead, faint symbols were etched into the stone, spirals and jagged lines that seemed to shimmer when the light hit them at certain angles. The air was heavy, thick with an unplaceable scent that made his stomach churn. His footsteps echoed unnaturally, the sound distorted as if the chamber were far larger than it appeared. Elias felt a sudden wave of vertigo, his vision blurring as the symbols seemed to writhe beneath the beam of his flashlight. He stopped, taking a deep breath to steady himself. For the first time in years, he felt the thrill of true discovery, a sensation he had thought lost to the monotony of cataloging artifacts and debating academic politics. This was what he had been searching for, something untouched, unrecorded, something ancient. But as he stood there, another feeling crept in, colder and sharper than the excitement. It was the feeling of being watched, though he knew he was alone. The chamber seemed to hum faintly, a low vibration that he could feel in his bones. He couldn't tell if it was coming from the walls, the symbols, or something deeper within the stone. Elias adjusted his flashlight and moved further into the chamber, his heart pounding in his chest. Whatever lay ahead, he knew there was no turning back. Something had brought him here, something older than Petra, older than human history itself, and it was waiting. Elias descended cautiously into the dark corridor revealed by the crevice, his flashlight barely cutting through the heavy blackness. The walls seemed to press in, the air growing colder with each step. The passageway was rough, carved crudely into the rock. But as he moved further, the surface became unnervingly smooth, as if sculpted by something beyond human hands. His fingers brushed against the walls, which felt oddly warm despite the chill in the air. The sensation made his skin crawl. The passage twisted and turned, leading him deeper into the heart of the cliffs. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the soft crunch of his boots against the stone floor and the occasional drip of water echoing from somewhere unseen. The smell of damp earth gave way to something more acrid, a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of his throat. He had explored countless tombs and ruins, but nothing felt like this. The oppressive weight of the space was unlike anything he had ever experienced, as though the very rock resented his intrusion. After what felt like hours, the passage abruptly opened into a cavernous chamber. Elias stopped, his flashlight beam sweeping over the space. The room was vast, the ceiling arching high above and disappearing into shadow. The walls were covered in carvings, but these were not the flowing, decorative designs of the Nabateans. They were angular and chaotic, a swirling mass of jagged lines and interlocking spirals that seemed to shift when viewed from the corner of his eye. The symbols were unfamiliar, almost alien, yet they tugged at something deep in his mind, stirring an unease he couldn't place. In the center of the room stood a circular structure, its surface smooth and seamless. It resembled a well, but its edges were adorned with strange metallic ridges that glinted in the beam of his flashlight. Around the base were scattered objects that defied explanation, artifacts that bore no resemblance to anything he had studied. One looked like a tool, though its edges were organic and flowing, as if molded from a living material. Another was a jagged shard of metal that hummed faintly when he picked it up, the vibration tingling unpleasantly in his fingers. Elias knelt beside the circular structure, his pulse racing. It was massive, the diameter wide enough to fit several people, and its surface was etched with the same strange symbols as the walls. He reached out, running his hand along the rim. The material was cold and smooth, but there was an odd give to it, almost like skin stretched over bone. His stomach churned, but he couldn't pull away. As he examined the symbols more closely, he noticed something odd. Small indentations along the edge of the structure. They looked like they were meant to hold something, though what, he couldn't say. He retrieved the strange tool he had found earlier, its shape oddly fitting the size of the grooves. Almost instinctively, he slid the tool into one of the indentations. A low, guttural noise reverberated through the chamber, sending vibrations through the floor and up his legs. Elias froze, his heart pounding. The noise grew louder, a deep rhythmic hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The symbols on the walls began to glow faintly, their light pulsating in time with the hum. The chamber felt alive, the air vibrating with a palpable energy. He stumbled back, his flashlight flickering as the structure began to shift. The metallic ridges around its edge moved, twisting and interlocking like the gears of an impossibly complex machine. Then came the sound, a guttural screech that tore through the air, so loud and raw that it made Elias clap his hands over his ears. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, a vibration that rattled his bones and made his teeth ache. The well, or whatever it was, began to open, its surface peeling back like the petals of a grotesque flower. What lay beneath was not water or stone, but a pulsing, shifting void that seemed to defy the very concept of space. The light emanating from it was not light as he knew it. It was cold, piercing, and alive. Elias staggered back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The air was thick now, heavy with a scent he couldn't place, something sharp and organic, like blood and ozone. He felt a prickling along his skin, a sensation like tiny needles pressing into his flesh. His flashlight flickered again and died, leaving him in near total darkness, except for the cold, unearthly glow from the void. Something moved. It was subtle at first, a ripple in the air above the void, but then it grew, taking form. The shape was indistinct, shifting and warping as though it couldn't fully exist in this world. Elias stumbled back, his foot catching on a jagged rock, sending him sprawling to the ground. His eyes never left the void as the shape solidified into something monstrous. It was immense, its form a grotesque amalgamation of sinew and carapace, its surface glistening with a sickly, wet sheen. Its limbs were long and segmented, ending in jagged points that clicked against the stone as it moved. Its face, or what passed for one, was a writhing mass of tendrils that twitched and pulsed in rhythm with the humming chamber. Elias's mind screamed at him to run, but his body refused to obey. He could only watch as the creature turned its attention to him, its movements unnervingly fluid, like a predator stalking its prey. The air grew colder, the light dimmer, as though the very chamber was succumbing to the presence of this thing. For the first time in his life, Elias felt true terror. Not the fear of death, but the fear of something far worse. Something ancient, something incomprehensible. He was no longer an archaeologist uncovering a lost civilization. He was an intruder in a place that should have remained forgotten. And whatever he had awakened was not going to let him leave. Elias lay on the cold stone floor of the chamber, paralyzed by the sight of the creature looming over the swirling void. His breaths came in shallow gasps, his chest tight with a suffocating pressure that seemed to emanate from the very air around him. The hum of the chamber had grown deafening, a low, resonant vibration that pulsed in his ears and rattled his bones. His fingers curled against the floor, desperate for something solid in this nightmarish reality. The creature's movements were deliberate, its elongated limbs bending and twisting in unnatural ways as it emerged fully from the void. Its body shimmered with a wet, membranous sheen, the tendrils on its face writhing with a life of their own. Each step it took sent a sharp, metallic scrape echoing through the chamber, the sound tearing through the oppressive hum. It wasn't just moving, it was studying him, its alien form radiating an intelligence that was more chilling than its grotesque appearance. Elias forced himself to move, crawling backward until his back pressed against the chamber wall. The symbols carved into the stone glowed brighter as the creature approached, their light casting grotesque shadows that seemed to twist and stretch unnaturally. He reached for the flashlight at his side, his fingers fumbling with its cold metal surface. The beam flickered weakly, illuminating the creature for a brief moment before sputtering out again. What little he saw was enough to turn his stomach. The creature's body was covered in pulsating sacs, translucent enough to reveal dark, liquid shapes shifting inside. Its limbs ended in jagged, chitinous protrusions that clicked against the stone as it moved. The tendrils on its face vibrated in tandem with the chamber's hum, emitting an eerie, rhythmic clicking sound that seemed to echo in Elias's mind as much as in the room. It was communicating, he realized with a jolt of terror, not with him, but with the chamber itself. The symbols on the walls began to move, not physically, but in a way that defied understanding. They shimmered and shifted, their patterns rearranging into new configurations that Elias couldn't begin to decipher. It was as if the chamber was alive, responding to the creature's presence. He pressed his palms against the ground, the vibrations coursing through his body, and tried to focus. His mind was racing, torn between the overwhelming urge to flee and the primal curiosity that had driven him to this place. A sharp, piercing noise cut through the chamber, and Elias cried out, clamping his hands over his ears. The sound wasn't natural. It was a shriek of metal tearing against metal, of frequencies that shouldn't exist. The creature's tendrils flared outward, their tips glowing faintly with a sickly green light. It turned its head toward him, its eyeless face fixating on him with a terrifying intensity. The shriek ceased, replaced by a low, guttural growl that made the floor beneath him vibrate. Elias scrambled to his feet, his eyes darting toward the circular structure at the center of the room. The void inside it had grown darker, its swirling mass now crackling with arcs of pale blue light. The chamber was changing, its once solid walls now rippling as though made of liquid stone. He had triggered something far more dangerous than he could have imagined. His gaze fell to the strange tool he had used to open the passage, now lying a few feet away where he had dropped it. He lunged for it, his hand closing around its alien surface, just as the creature surged forward. A limb lashed out, its jagged edge grazing his arm. Pain exploded through him as his sleeve tore away, revealing a deep gash. Blood dripped onto the floor, but it wasn't just blood. The wound bubbled, dark veins spidering out from the cut as the flesh around it writhed unnaturally. Elias screamed, clutching his arm as the pain spread. His skin burned and twisted, the veins pulsating with an otherworldly light. The creature emitted another clicking sound, this one sharper and faster, as if in response to his agony. It wasn't trying to kill him, not yet. It was testing him, marking him, transforming him. Desperation surged through Elias as he staggered toward the circular structure. The tool in his hand vibrated faintly, resonating with the symbols on the structure's surface. He pressed it into one of the grooves, his fingers trembling as he twisted it into place. The chamber responded immediately, the humming growing louder, more erratic. The symbols on the walls flared, their light now blinding, as the void began to collapse in on itself. The creature howled, a sound so alien and primal that it reverberated in Elias's chest. It lashed out, its limbs slicing through the air with terrifying speed. One struck his side, the impact sending him sprawling to the ground. The pain was blinding, but he clung to the tool, his grip tightening as he forced himself to his knees. The void was changing, its surface folding inward, the arcs of light growing more violent. The creature thrashed, its movements frantic as it turned its attention to the collapsing void. Elias seized the moment, using the last of his strength to twist the tool further into the mechanism. The chamber shook violently, dust and debris raining down from the ceiling. The void let out a deafening roar, its light imploding into a single, blinding point before winking out entirely. The silence that followed was absolute. The creature staggered, its limbs twitching as the light in its tendrils flickered and died. It collapsed to the ground, its massive form convulsing before finally lying still. The walls of the chamber dimmed, the glowing symbols fading into darkness. Elias collapsed beside the structure, his body trembling with exhaustion and pain. His arm throbbed, the veins around the wound still pulsating faintly. The air was heavy with the acrid stench of burnt stone and flesh, and the oppressive silence was broken only by the sound of his ragged breathing. He stared at the creature's lifeless form, the realization dawning on him with a chilling clarity. He had stopped it, but only for now. The void was gone, but the chamber still pulsed faintly with the hum of energy. The gate was closed, but the marks it had left on him, and on this place, would never truly fade. Elias dragged himself to the passageway, each movement a battle against the searing pain in his body. The world above felt impossibly far away, but he knew he had to reach it. Whatever had been awakened in this chamber was only the beginning, and whatever was now inside him, growing and changing, was a horror he wasn't sure he could outrun. Elias stumbled out of the chamber, his body battered and his mind fractured, but he wasn't alone. He could feel it now, a presence inside him, moving just beneath his skin. Every step he took up the winding passage was agony, the pulsating veins radiating heat and pain as they spread across his arm and chest. His breathing was shallow, each exhale carrying the faint, coppery tang of blood. The creature may have fallen, the gate may have collapsed, but the horror wasn't over. It was only beginning. The passage blurred as he climbed, his flashlight casting erratic shadows on the walls. His vision swam, the world tilting unnaturally, as if the earth itself had turned hostile. Somewhere in the distance, he thought he heard the faint echo of clicking, a rhythm that matched the pulsing in his veins. His head throbbed, each beat of his heart a reminder that he wasn't alone in his own body anymore. At last, he emerged into the pale light of dawn. The desert sky stretched wide and indifferent, its brilliant colors mocking the terror that clung to him like a second skin. Elias collapsed to his knees, gasping for air as the warmth of the sun pressed against his back. For a brief moment, he thought he might be safe. But then it came, a searing wave of pain that shot through his chest and down his spine, forcing him to the ground. He screamed, clawing at the ground as his body convulsed. Beneath his skin, the veins writhed like living things, shifting and bulging unnaturally. His arm, the site of the creature's touch, had transformed into something grotesque. The flesh was translucent, revealing dark, branching filaments that pulsed with a sickly green light. His hand no longer felt like his own. The fingers were elongated, tipped with faintly gleaming ridges that looked disturbingly like claws. "No," he whispered hoarsely, his voice trembling. "No, no, no." Elias clutched at his arm, trying to suppress the transformation, but it was futile. The changes were spreading, moving through him like wildfire. His mind reeled as fragmented images filled his thoughts. Visions of the creature, of the void, of countless other worlds consumed by the same force. It wasn't just inside him, it was him now, and its purpose was clear: to spread, to consume, to remake. The realization hit him with the force of a blow. The gate hadn't been just a doorway. It had been a seed planted here eons ago by something far older than humanity. The creature wasn't an invader. It was a harbinger, a scout sent to prepare this world for whatever unimaginable horrors followed. And now, through him, it had found a new way to take root. Elias forced himself to his feet, his entire body trembling with the effort. He stumbled toward the ruins of Petra, the familiar shapes of the treasury and the surrounding cliffs rising before him. But they felt different now, smaller, insignificant against the vastness of what he had awakened. The ancient city was quiet, its paths empty, but Elias could sense it. Something was stirring in the depths below, where the gate had once stood. The faint clicking sounds returned, growing louder, closer. At first he thought they were coming from within his own body, but then he realized they were external. His head snapped toward the sound, his heart pounding as a shadow moved along the edge of the cliffs. Then another, and another. They were here. From the corners of his vision he saw them emerging, figures that moved with a terrible, fluid grace, their bodies glinting faintly in the morning light. They weren't like the creature he had encountered in the chamber. They were smaller, faster, their forms lean and predatory. Their eyes, or what passed for eyes, glowed faintly with the same green hue that now burned beneath his skin. Elias backed away, his mind screaming for escape, but his body wouldn't respond. He was rooted in place, his legs trembling as the first of the creatures approached. It tilted its head, studying him with a detached curiosity. Then, to his horror, it stopped and bowed its head slightly, as though in recognition. They knew him. They sensed him. Elias's stomach turned as he understood. He was no longer just a victim. He was one of them now, or he would be soon. The transformation was incomplete, but the creatures recognized what he was becoming. The thought brought a fresh wave of nausea, but it also sparked something else. Resolve. This couldn't spread. Whatever had begun in that chamber had to end with him. The visions he had seen, the galaxies torn apart, the world swallowed whole, were too much to bear. If the transformation continued, if he lost control, he would be the key to something far worse. Summoning every ounce of strength, Elias turned and ran. The creatures gave chase, their clicking limbs scraping against the stone with an unnatural speed, but he didn't look back. His body screamed in protest, the alien growths inside him tearing at his insides, but he pushed forward, his goal clear. He had to reach the edge of the cliffs, where the path gave way to a sheer drop into the rocky gorge below. As he reached the precipice, his legs gave out, and he collapsed to his knees. The creatures surrounded him, their movements slow and deliberate now, as though they knew there was no escape. Elias looked down at his arm, the grotesque transformation now spreading across his chest and neck. His vision blurred, but his determination remained sharp. "This ends here," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You don't win." With the last of his strength, Elias hurled himself over the edge. The wind roared in his ears, the ground rushing up to meet him as the creatures peered down from above. But as he fell, his thoughts weren't of death. They were of the gate, of the terror he had unleashed, and of the fragile hope that his sacrifice might keep it contained. The impact came with a sickening finality, and for a moment all was still. The desert swallowed the sound, leaving only the silence of the cliffs and the shifting sands. Above, the creatures lingered at the edge of the precipice, their glowing eyes fixed on the broken figure far below. One by one they turned and disappeared into the shadows, their forms dissolving into the light of the rising sun. The desert remained quiet, its ancient secrets buried once more. But somewhere deep below, in the hidden chamber beneath Petra, the symbols on the walls began to glow again, faint but persistent, as if waiting for the next traveler, bold or foolish enough to uncover them.